My name is Walter Grayson. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in a modest, red brick bungalow just outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I've been retired for over a decade now, having taught high school history for nearly 40 years. The house is quiet most days. Quieter than it used to be when Martha was still alive. She passed away 6 years ago, just after Thanksgiving. And since then the days have unfolded like slow, predictable pages of a book I've already read too many times. My routines are steady and plain. I rise at 6, make oatmeal, read the newspaper, and drive to the post office 3 times a week, even if there's nothing in the mailbox. Sometimes I stop by the library or the diner on 53rd Street, where old-timers like me sit in silence or chat about things that don't matter much anymore. The car I drive is a 1998 Ford Taurus, green with a slight rust spot on the rear bumper, and I keep it spotless. Martha used to joke that I treated it better than I treated myself. But she loved that car too. We bought it together in the spring after our 25th wedding anniversary and drove it up to Door County every summer for nearly 2 decades. That car is more than just transportation. It's a piece of my life. A rolling album of memories that still smells faintly of her rose-scented hand cream and the lemon air freshener she insisted on hanging from the rearview mirror. My daughter Melissa has never understood why I keep it. She says it's outdated, unsafe, inefficient. A dinosaur, as she puts it with that half-smile she wears when she wants to sound reasonable but still get her way. She lives about 30 minutes away, in a sleek modern house with glass railings and quartz countertops, and one of those refrigerators that tells you when the milk is low. Her husband, Stuart, is in real estate or finance. I never really understood which, and he never bothered to explain. Melissa visits about once a month, sometimes with Stuart, more often alone. The visits are brief, polite, a little cold around the edges. She brings me gluten-free muffins or organic teas I never asked for, and straightens things that don't need straightening. "You should consider a retirement community," she often says, walking from room to room like a realtor showing a property. Someplace with amenities, somewhere you don't have to worry about lawn care or winter shoveling. I nod but don't respond. I know she means well, or at least I used to believe that. Lately I'm not so sure. Last Christmas she gave me a subscription to a meal delivery service and cancelled my Sunday paper without asking. Said it was a waste of money and that I could read the news online. I didn't argue. I just called the Journal Sentinel and reinstated it myself. It's not that I hate technology. I've got a smartphone and I know how to use email, but I like the feel of paper between my fingers. I like things I can hold. And most of all, I like the car. That's where the trouble really started, with the car. A month ago, Melissa came by on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced. She had that tone, the one that tells me a decision has already been made, and I'm just being informed out of courtesy. "Dad," she said, not even bothering to sit down, "it's time to sell the Taurus. You don't need it. You barely drive, and let's be honest, it's not safe anymore. What if the brakes fail? What if you get stranded somewhere? I can set up a ride service for you. There's an app for seniors now. You'll never have to worry about parking or maintenance again." I remember setting down my coffee, watching the steam curl upward while my heart clenched slightly. Not from fear or stubbornness, but from the familiar ache of being managed. I tried to keep my voice calm. "The car's fine, Melissa. I've kept it in good condition. I just had the oil changed last month." "It's 25 years old, Dad," she said, exasperated. "It's time." I could tell she wasn't going to drop it. But what stung wasn't the suggestion. It was the way she said it. Like I was some doddering fool clinging to junk, like I couldn't be trusted to know what I needed or wanted. That night, I sat in the garage for nearly an hour just staring at the Taurus. I ran my hand along the steering wheel, opened the glove compartment where Martha kept peppermints, pressed the radio button to hear the static buzz before it clicked into the classical station we used to listen to. I thought about what Melissa said, And I wondered, when did my daughter stop seeing me as a man and start seeing me as a burden? I wasn't always alone. Martha and I raised Melissa in this house. I built her a treehouse in the backyard when she was 8, and every summer I patched it up so she could play safely. We grilled on the patio, argued about curfews, watched her graduate from high school in the same auditorium where I once lectured on the Civil War. There were good years, chaotic years, hard years. But we were a family. Melissa used to call me Daddy in that sweet, breathy voice, especially when she wanted something. Somewhere along the line, that Daddy vanished. Now it's just Dad, clipped and businesslike. She tells me what's best, what's practical, what makes sense. She never asks how I feel about any of it. Maybe that's my fault. Maybe I stopped being open after Martha died. Maybe I turned too quiet, too set in my ways. Or maybe Melissa changed more than I realized. Her world is slick and fast, full of credit scores and lifestyle upgrades. Mine is made of quiet mornings, black coffee, and old cars with stories, and lately, I've begun to suspect that Melissa's concern isn't just about my safety. There's something else in her eyes when she talks about the car, a glint of calculation, as if she's already spent the money in her head. Stuart's business hasn't been doing well. She let that slip last year when I offered to pay for Hazel's tutoring. Maybe they need help again. Maybe she sees the Taurus not as a relic of my life with Martha, but as a quick way to cover a repair, a payment, a debt. She forgets that I notice things, that I was once a man whose job it was to read between the lines, to understand the subtext of a story. And this story, hers, is full of omissions. So I wait. I say nothing. I keep my keys in my coat pocket and the Taurus gassed and ready. And I remember what Martha once told me the last summer we went to Door County together. We were sitting on a picnic blanket near the lighthouse, eating turkey sandwiches. And she said, "Walter, people will always think they know what's best for you. Smile, nod, and when the time comes, do what you believe is right." That's what I intend to do. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, one of those days when winter still lingers in the shadows, even as the sun pretends it's already April. I was in the garage, polishing the dashboard of the Taurus with an old flannel rag, the kind Martha used to fold into quarters and tuck in the linen drawer. The garage door was open, letting in the crisp air, and the radio was playing softly. Some Mozart concerto, I think. That's when Melissa arrived, unannounced as always, but this time she wasn't alone. Stuart was with her. I heard the crunch of their tires on the gravel and straightened my back instinctively. There was something about Stuart's presence that always made me tense, like being watched by a man who was appraising you not as a person, but as a liability. He got out of the car slowly, adjusted his designer sunglasses, and glanced around like he was assessing a property for resale. Melissa wore her usual uniform of intention: sleek blazer, clipboard, and that purposeful stride that used to be charming when she was a teenager pretending to be in charge of her lemonade stand. Now it just made me brace for trouble. "Dad!" she called out, stepping into the garage without waiting to be invited. "We need to talk." Stuart followed, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the shelves of tools and oil cans like they offended his sense of order. I turned down the radio and faced them, the rag still in my hand. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the unease already coiling in my stomach. "We've found a buyer for the Taurus," Melissa said, as if that were the most normal sentence in the world. "It's a private collector in Madison. He restores vintage sedans. He offered $4,500, cash." I stared at her for a moment, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "You did what?" She gave a little sigh, as if I were a child refusing his vegetables. "Dad, come on. You haven't taken it more than 5 miles in the past month. You told me yourself your knees hurt when you drive, and you haven't been to Door County since Mom passed. Stuart knows the market. He says the value is going to drop soon. It's the best deal we're going to get. I looked at Stuart, who gave me a bland nod as if to confirm the statement. I didn't ask for it to be sold, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You didn't even talk to me first. We're talking now, Melissa replied briskly. Look, it's just sitting here collecting dust, and we could use the space for storage, reorganize things, maybe clean out that cabinet full of old stuff. Besides, it's not just about the car, it's about your safety, Dad. What if you forget to check the brakes? What if something happens and no one's around? There it was again, that veiled accusation wrapped in concern, that gentle suggestion that I was starting to slip. I check the brakes regularly, I said, and I don't drive if I don't feel sharp. You know that. You think you're sharp, Stuart said, finally speaking. His voice had that smug, polished edge that made me want to grind my teeth. But even the sharpest knives get dull with time. We just don't want to see something happen to you, or someone else. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I folded the rag and placed it on the workbench. And what do you need the money for? I asked. Is this about you two? Melissa stiffened slightly. No, this is about what's best for you. So this buyer, I said slowly. Did he contact you, or did you go looking? There was a brief pause. Stuart made some calls. Melissa admitted. He found someone through a friend. The guy's coming this weekend to take a look. I nodded slowly, taking it in. And what if I say no? Dad, Melissa said, and now her voice took on that brittle edge I recognized all too well, the one she used to use when she was 16 and grounded, trying to convince me to let her out of the house. This isn't about permission. This is about responsibility. We've already set things in motion. The man's coming whether you like it or not. My hands clenched at my sides. You had no right. We're your family, Stuart said. We have every right to step in when you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking just fine, I snapped. You're the ones making decisions behind my back. That's not family. That's manipulation. Melissa looked away, clearly trying to keep her composure. I knew you'd react like this. I told Stuart, but you're being irrational. You've let sentiment cloud your judgment. It's just a car. I wanted to scream. Just a car? This car had held my wife's laughter, our shared silences, the long rides into the countryside when we didn't need to speak, because just being near each other was enough. It had carried birthday cakes, library books, grocery bags, and fragile conversations about end-of-life plans. It was where I sat the night after she died, gripping the steering wheel because it still smelled like her. But I didn't say any of that. I just looked at them both and said, You're wrong. It's not just a car, and you've gone too far this time. You'll see, Melissa said tightly. You'll thank us later. They left without further discussion, and I stood there in the garage for a long time after their car disappeared down the street. The silence rang louder than any argument. I felt something shift inside me then, a small but undeniable crack in whatever remained of our trust. They hadn't just crossed a line, they'd stomped over it, waving their good intentions like a flag. And for the first time in years I felt not sadness, not disappointment, but a flicker of something sharper, something closer to resolve. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the overhead light off, the small lamp by the window casting just enough glow for me to see the chipped surface of the Formica, and the faded newspaper I didn't even bother to open. My thoughts moved in circles, slower than they used to, but no less sharp. I kept hearing Melissa's voice, calm, composed, patronizing, saying, "You'll thank us later," as if I were a stubborn toddler refusing his medicine. I kept seeing Stuart's smug look, his designer sunglasses tucked in his collar like a trophy, his hands in his pockets, as if everything around him was beneath his attention. There was no warmth in that garage meeting, no affection, no attempt to understand. Just a decision already made, handed to me like a dismissal. I kept turning the same thing over in my mind. They had found a buyer for my car without even asking if I wanted to sell it. They didn't just presume I'd agree, they assumed they could do it regardless. That wasn't concern. That was control. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I went into the garage early. The Taurus sat there, gleaming in the soft light like a stubborn relic from a more honest time. I ran my hand along the hood, opened the door, and slipped into the driver's seat. Everything smelled like it always had. Leather, dust, a trace of Martha's old floral air freshener. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet. Then I pulled the keys from the ignition slot and dropped them into my coat pocket. I wasn't going to let them take it. Not like this. Later that day I called my mechanic, Sal, the one I'd gone to for over 20 years. I told him I wanted the car inspected top to bottom, tires, brakes, fluids, everything. He said to bring it in on Monday. I said I'd be there. I didn't tell Melissa. On Sunday, Melissa showed up again. Alone this time. I heard her knock, and when I opened the door, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "The buyer's coming at 2, she said, checking her phone like she was late for a meeting. "He's bringing a tow truck in case you don't want to drive it." "You haven't changed your mind, have you?" I looked at her and said, "I already told you, this car isn't for sale." She blinked at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. "Dad, we talked about this." "No," I said calmly. "You talked. I listened. I said no, and I meant it." Her jaw tightened. "Please don't make a scene. He's already on the road." "Then you'd better call him and tell him to turn around." She stepped inside without being invited, pacing into the living room, standing stiff in front of the fireplace like an interrogator. "This is irrational. You don't need the car. You don't even go anywhere. You can't even walk to the end of the block without limping." "I go where I need to," I replied. "And when I can't, I'll decide what to do. Not you." She scoffed and pulled out her phone. "You're being difficult for no reason. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe we need to talk about power of attorney." That hit me like a slap. I'd known it was coming. I'd felt it coming. But to hear her say it aloud, like a threat, made something twist deep inside me. "Excuse me?" I asked, voice low. She didn't look up from her screen. "There's a process. If you're showing signs of cognitive decline, the court can appoint someone to help manage your affairs. It's not uncommon." I felt my hands tighten at my sides. "You mean you'd take me to court, have me declared incompetent because I won't give you what you want?" "No," she said quickly. "Of course not. I'm just saying, if you can't make safe decisions, someone has to step in, for your own protection." "My protection?" I echoed, bitter. "You mean to protect me from myself?" "From mistakes, from forgetting things, from hurting yourself or others." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "So that's what you've decided. I'm senile. Is that what you've been telling people?" She didn't answer, but her silence was damning. "I've made mistakes, sure." I continued. "I forget things, names, phone numbers, but I haven't forgotten who I am. I haven't forgotten how to drive a car, how to live my life, how to recognize manipulation dressed up as kindness." She sighed and put her phone away. "Fine. Keep the car. Just know that if something happens, it's on you." She stormed out and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the clock on the mantel. That night, I didn't sleep either. I kept thinking about what she said, about power of attorney, about taking control. I remembered stories from neighbours, men I'd known at the library or church, who had been quietly shuffled into care homes because their children claimed it was necessary. One of them, Harold, used to sit beside me at the diner every Thursday. One day he'd just vanished. I later learned his son had filed for conservatorship after Harold wrote 2 checks to the same charity. No one asked if Harold was okay. They just took the pen out of his hand and locked the drawer. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. On Monday, I drove the Taurus to Sal's. He gave it a thorough once-over and told me the brakes were in good shape, the fluids clean, the battery strong. "She's got years in her, Walt," he said, patting the hood like it was a loyal dog. "Don't let anyone talk you out of her unless you're ready." I thanked him and paid in cash. As I was leaving, I asked him if he ever appraised vehicles for insurance or legal purposes. "Sure," he said, "all the time. Want me to write one up?" I nodded. "Yeah, I might need it soon." "Something wrong?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just looked out at the road and said, "Not yet, but it's coming." That evening when I got home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was unlocked. I always locked it. Always. Inside, the car was untouched, but the drawers where I kept my documents had clearly been opened. My registration papers were out of order. The title folder was upside down. Nothing missing, but everything slightly disturbed, like someone had rifled through them and left in a hurry. I sat down at the workbench and stared at the drawers for a long time. Then I went inside, locked the door, and put the keys to the Taurus under my pillow. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just wait for them to come for the car. I wasn't going to let them frame me as confused, forgetful, or dangerous. I had to protect what was mine, my memories, my dignity, and my freedom to decide how the final years of my life would unfold. And if that meant fighting back in ways they didn't expect, so be it. The days that followed the confrontation with Melissa were filled with a strange tension that seemed to stretch and thicken the air around me, making even the simplest moments feel heavy with unspoken threats. I kept a close eye on the Taurus, parking it farther from the house whenever I could, and locking the garage door twice, sometimes thrice, to guard against unseen intrusions. Despite the precautions, the feeling of invasion lingered, like shadows creeping along the walls after dark. Then, one afternoon, the unexpected happened. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a cup of black coffee and flipping through a photo album from my younger days, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm and professional, introducing herself as Sarah, a paralegal from a local law firm. She said she was calling on behalf of a client who claimed to have partial ownership rights to a property connected to me. I was confused and asked for clarification. It turned out that Melissa and Stuart had taken steps behind my back to transfer ownership of their second car, the sleek black Lexus they used for daily drives, into a joint title that included my name. The explanation Sarah offered was that this was done to protect the asset from potential financial troubles they were facing, but it also meant that legally I was now a co-owner. At first, the news felt like a surprise wrapped in irony. Here I was, being told I had a stake in a vehicle I'd hardly seen, while they insisted on selling my beloved Taurus. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time, letting the information settle. If I was a co-owner, that meant I had rights I hadn't known I still held. And with those rights came possibilities. I realized that I could, if I chose, take control in a way I never thought I would. Over the next few days, I dug through old papers and made several calls to the Department of Motor Vehicles to understand the legal implications. I learned that, as a co-owner, I could potentially sell my share or even petition to have the car sold, with proceeds divided accordingly. It was a complicated process, involving notifications and waiting periods, but it was within my reach. Meanwhile, Melissa's calls became less frequent, though the silence between us grew colder. Stuart avoided any conversation I tried to start, and I felt increasingly like a spectator in my own life. Then came the moment that truly shifted everything. I received a letter from the DMV confirming that my claim to co-ownership was valid, and that I had the right to submit paperwork to sell the Lexus if I wished, provided proper procedures were followed. It was like finding a lifeline tossed into stormy seas. With renewed determination, I contacted an old friend from the neighborhood who now worked as a real estate agent, hoping to find someone who might help me with the sale. We spoke about the process, the paperwork, the potential buyers. The idea of selling their car, their possession, felt like a quiet but potent act of reclaiming my agency. At the same time, I arranged for an appraisal of the Taurus to have a clear understanding of its value. I was surprised when the mechanic's estimate came back higher than I expected. It seemed that my careful maintenance had preserved the car better than I imagined. This gave me a strange satisfaction, proof that some things, even in a world that seemed to be pushing me out, still held their worth. I kept this information to myself, reluctant to give Melissa and Stuart any more ammunition. But the deeper realization was that this wasn't just about cars or money anymore. It was about respect, about being seen as a person with rights and choices, even when others wanted to deny them. One evening, while sitting on the porch watching the sun set behind the distant trees, I thought about the path that had brought me here. From a warm family with Martha and Melissa, to this fractured, strained existence where love had been replaced by power plays and silent resentments. The sting of betrayal was real, but so was the flicker of hope, the hope that I could still stand up for myself, that I could rewrite the narrative that had long been dictated by others. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, I felt a quiet courage settle in my chest. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer alone. I had allies in my own history, in the law, and in the unbroken will to keep living life on my own terms. This middle point was not an end, but a crossroads. And as I sat there, watching the sky turn from gold to violet, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not be pushed aside quietly. I would reclaim what was mine, piece by piece, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace in the process. The following weeks unfolded like a slow-moving storm, not in the form of crashing thunder or lightning strikes, but in the quiet pressure of heavy clouds gathering above and the sense of something inevitable approaching. I could feel it in my bones, in the stiffness of my joints, and in the tone of Melissa's increasingly infrequent phone calls, which shifted from strained pleasantries to abrupt interrogations that made it clear she suspected I was up to something. Her voice, once merely dismissive, had begun to sharpen with an edge of barely concealed impatience, as though the very act of maintaining civility had become an exhausting burden. I didn't respond to her questions about the Taurus. I offered no updates on my activities and dodged inquiries about my finances. I had learned, slowly but thoroughly, that any information I offered would be used against me. Not in court, perhaps, but in the courtroom of family manipulation, where every small admission could be twisted into proof of frailty, of unreliability, of fading judgment. One Friday afternoon, I received a letter, not from Melissa this time, but from a law office in downtown Milwaukee. I recognized the firm's name from a billboard near the highway, one of those ads promising aggressive representation and swift justice. The letter was brief, clinical, and unmistakably strategic. It stated that a petition had been filed for a medical competency evaluation regarding my mental state, citing concerns expressed by immediate family members regarding recent erratic behavior, poor judgment in personal affairs, and an increasing pattern of confusion and memory lapses. I read it 3 times before setting it down on the table. My hands weren't shaking, but I could feel a pulse in my fingertips that reminded me of the way Martha used to press her palm against mine when she sensed I was holding something in. For a long time, I sat there staring out the window, the letter beside my untouched coffee, the sun slanting across the linoleum floor in gold lines that cut through the quiet like razors. I wasn't surprised, but I was wounded. There was a distinct cruelty in the formal tone of that letter, in the language that reduced me to a liability. It didn't matter that I had paid off my mortgage, kept my records in order, filed my taxes on time, remembered every birthday, and stocked my pantry with labels facing forward. To Melissa and Stuart, those things no longer mattered. What mattered was the narrative they had begun to weave, that I was slipping, faltering, declining, and that narrative would serve them better than the truth ever could. That evening, I called a former student of mine named Carl Dunning, now a practicing attorney who specialized in elder law. He'd once written a term paper on the constitutional limits of guardianship, and ironically quoted me in the opening paragraph. When he answered the phone, there was a moment of hesitation before he said, "Mr. Grayson?" I told him about the letter, and by the time I finished, he was already offering to represent me pro bono, saying, "You were the first person who taught me to see the law as something more than rules. You taught me it was about protecting people who couldn't speak loudly enough for themselves. We scheduled an in-person meeting for the next Monday." Meanwhile, I prepared a folder of every document I could find: property records, car titles, bank statements, tax filings, medical records, and a printed email thread with Melissa from the past 2 years. I even included photographs of the Taurus and a timeline of events, annotated in my own handwriting. I treated it like a lesson plan, something I used to build and revise until it could withstand the scrutiny of 30 restless teenagers. On Monday morning, Carl read through everything with an expression of quiet disbelief. "They're really going for it," he said, flipping through the medical report Melissa had attached, signed by a doctor I'd never met. "This isn't just a push, it's a shove." "What can I do?" I asked. "We challenge it. We ask for an independent assessment, and if necessary, we bring in character witnesses, records, whatever it takes. You're competent, Mr. Grayson. You're articulate, organized, and aware of your rights. This is about money, not memory loss." I nodded, grateful but weary. Carl filed the motion by the end of the day. That night, I found it difficult to sleep. I kept thinking of the way Melissa used to sit at the dining table doing her homework while I corrected papers, the way she'd ask questions about Roosevelt or the Louisiana Purchase, wide-eyed and curious. I remembered the smell of her shampoo when she hugged me, the scrape of her bicycle on the sidewalk as she rode in loops around the block. I had loved her, truly, with the full capacity of a father's heart. But that girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who looked at me and saw nothing but an obstacle between her and whatever it was she thought she deserved. Days passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Carl arranged for a neurologist and a gerontologist to examine me. I passed every test they put before me: recall, logic, motor skills, reflexes, with results that placed me well above average for my age. The doctors shook my hand and told me I had nothing to worry about. But I worried anyway. I worried about what it meant that my own daughter had tried to declare me unfit. I worried about what would have happened if I hadn't fought back. One afternoon, a neighbor named Florence stopped by with banana bread. She was in her 70s too, a widow who lived down the street, and we sometimes talked about weather and television over the fence. That day she looked uneasy. "Melissa came by," she said after a pause. "Said you were struggling, that maybe you needed help. She asked if I'd noticed anything odd." I thanked Florence, took the bread, and closed the door gently behind her. I didn't need to explain. The shame was already thick in my throat. Melissa had been sowing seeds in the neighborhood, trying to build a case. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I called the DMV and submitted the necessary paperwork to begin the process of claiming the Lexus as abandoned property, citing over 6 months of non-use and documentation of my legal co-ownership. At the same time, I contacted Carl and asked him to help me explore options regarding my financial relationship with Melissa, namely, the joint account I'd kept open since she was in college. We reviewed the transfer history, and it became clear that for years she had been withdrawing monthly deposits without a single note of thanks. I had given freely, hoping it was helping her through rough patches, but now I saw it for what it was, a silent, one-way siphon of obligation. Within the week, I had closed the account and moved the remaining funds to my personal portfolio. It wasn't vengeance, it was liberation, and it wasn't long before the silence shattered. Melissa called 3 times in one evening, each message more frantic than the last. In the final one, she said, "Dad, you can't do this. We were just trying to help. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I walked out to the garage, opened the door, and stood beside the Taurus. It was dusk, the air just beginning to cool. The car gleamed in the soft light, unchanged, unmoved, undiminished. I climbed inside, shut the door, and for a moment I just sat there, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and age and memory. Then I turned the key, listened to the engine purr to life, and knew, whatever happened next, I was ready. It was early morning when the official letter arrived, slipped through the mail slot like any other envelope, unmarked, almost innocent. The seal in the corner was from the county court, and the text within was short and brutal. The petition for medical conservatorship filed by Melissa Hollis had been formally denied. The findings from the independent medical examinations were cited plainly. No evidence of cognitive decline, no signs of dementia, no clinical justification for limitation of personal or financial autonomy. The language was cold, factual, but as I read it, I felt something inside me thaw that I hadn't realized had gone numb. The part of me that still believed in justice. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my coffee. The silence in the house felt different that morning, not heavy and stifling, but spacious and clear, as if something long lodged in my chest had been lifted. I walked out onto the porch, letting the screen door slam behind me. The air was cool, sweet with the smell of damp grass. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe without measuring it against anxiety. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end, that Melissa wouldn't retreat quietly, not after losing control of the narrative she'd spent months shaping. I was right. 2 days later, she came unannounced. I saw her silver SUV pull into the driveway from the kitchen window and watched her sit in the driver's seat for nearly 5 minutes before she got out. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was loose, disheveled in a way that was unnatural for someone as polished as she'd always been. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. I stayed seated. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but brittle. "Can we talk?" I nodded towards the chair opposite me and waited. She sat down and looked around the kitchen like she didn't recognize it. "I didn't want it to come to this," she began, eyes glossy with what might have been emotion or calculation. "I was scared. You were acting closed off, secretive. It felt like you were slipping away." I let her speak. "You were always so careful, so organized. And then suddenly you wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't talk to me about the car, the money, anything." Stuart said maybe it was time we stepped in before something irreversible happened. Her voice cracked at the end, but I couldn't tell if it was real. I looked at her and said calmly, "You tried to take my autonomy." "I was trying to protect you," she said, louder now, desperate. "From what?" I asked. "From loneliness? From a quiet life you don't understand? or from my ability to say no. She looked down. You don't know how hard things have been for us. Stuart lost a major client. Hazel's tuition doubled. We were drowning. I thought maybe if we just took the pressure off you, just for a while. You mean took control? I interrupted. Not helped. Took. She didn't deny it. We thought you wouldn't notice. She said finally, that you'd fade gently. The honesty of it stung more than any lie. I stared at her for a long moment, then stood up and walked to the drawer where I kept a folder with copies of every legal step I'd taken. The closed joint account, the DMV's decision granting me the right to sell the Lexus as abandoned property, the pending listing on the Taurus I'd submitted to a classic car dealer in Chicago. I laid them in front of her. She didn't touch them, but her eyes moved rapidly across each page. You're selling everything? She asked. What do you need the money for? I don't, I said, but I don't want you to think you can get it. Her face twisted. Shame, fury, grief, I couldn't tell. We're your family. Were, I said. You were, a long time ago. I saw something collapse in her shoulders, but I didn't offer comfort. It was too late for that. She stood up without another word, gathered her purse, and walked to the door. At the threshold she turned and looked at me one last time. You're going to die alone, Dad. We all do, I replied, but some of us live first. And then she left. I didn't follow her. I didn't watch her drive away. I just sat back down, picked up my coffee, and took a long, slow sip. It was cold. I didn't care. That night, I opened the garage and stood before the Taurus one last time. I opened the trunk and laid inside the folder of documents, the registration, the appraisal. In the morning, I'd be driving it to Chicago. It would fetch a good price, more than it was worth in dollars. It was the final gesture in a long, bitter play, one I hadn't asked to star in, but had chosen not to exit quietly. I turned off the garage light, closed the door, and walked back into the house. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock, and in that moment, it was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. The Taurus was gone by the end of the week. I watched it roll away on the back of a flatbed, its green paint still catching the morning light with quiet dignity, the same way it had the day Martha and I drove it off the lot. I didn't wave. I didn't film it. I didn't even lock the gate behind the truck. I just stood there for a long time in the middle of the driveway, letting the silence settle around me like snowfall. There was no ceremony, no one to witness it but me, and that felt right. That car had carried decades of memories. Birthdays, quiet drives to the countryside, grocery trips with laughter that still echoed in the back seat. But I had finally accepted that memories don't live in machines. They live in us. And I was still here. With the sale finalized, the funds quietly transferred, and every trace of joint ownership unraveled, I took the next step I'd long postponed. I moved. I didn't tell Melissa. I didn't send a forwarding address. I left the keys to the house with a lawyer and arranged for the property to be handled discreetly. I found a small apartment on the edge of a park, a quiet corner unit with wide windows and a soft western light that warmed the living room in the late afternoon. The neighbors kept to themselves, and no one knew my name. I liked it that way. I bought new furniture. Simple, practical. Mine. I put up one framed photo of Martha, the one where she's squinting into the sun, holding her hat with both hands, laughing without trying. I kept the rest of the photos in a box, not out of denial, but to remind myself that I had more future than I once believed. Some nights I'd sit by the window with a book and lose track of the hours. Other nights I'd just listen to the birds outside and let the stillness anchor me. There was no anger anymore, no bubbling resentment. What had happened with Melissa was not a wound I intended to nurse forever. It was a scar now, healed over but visible, something I carried not with shame, but with clarity. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. A month after the move, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, there was a voicemail from Hazel, my granddaughter. Her voice was soft, hesitant, unsteady. "Hi, Grandpa. I heard what happened. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Mom didn't tell us anything. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I miss you, and if you ever want to talk, I'm here." I listened to the message 3 times. I didn't call back. Not yet. I wasn't ready, but I saved the number. I kept it written on a small slip of paper tucked behind Martha's photo, where I could find it when the time came. Because maybe, someday, I would call. Maybe there was something left in that direction worth walking toward. But not today. Today was mine. I brewed a pot of tea, opened the window, and let the light in.